Welcome to this segment on externalities. We're going to take a look at pollution. We're also going to take a look at the positive contributions of society and the market failure and the role of government in our microeconomic decision making. So externalities, here we go. Pollution, we're all familiar with it. We see it all the time. We see probably more of it than we want to see, right? And so we look at this as what we call an externality, a side effect, a negative one perhaps. In these cases, we see a lot of stuff that can be recycled here, but as you can see, it's a hot mess, and not sure what brought that in. But as we can see here, it is a side effect of products that are being sold. All of these products that we see here were probably on the shelf at one time. A glamorous product that was sold by someone who used up the product and then threw it away. Or maybe they didn't throw it away. Maybe they just threw it on the street. They littered or whatever. Anyway, it ended up here, and now it's a hot mess that needs to be cleaned up. So let's talk about externalities. What are they? And what do we do about them? So the idea here is an externality is a third person side effect. What does that mean? Well, it means that the person who made the product isn't having to deal with that pollution. The person who bought the product clearly isn't having to deal with that solution. But the person who goes to the pond or the lake in this case and wants to go fishing on the lake or go swimming in the lake obviously is having to deal with a lot of pollution caused by other people. So they are the third person, if you will, the innocent bystander that is affected negatively as a result of this. Now, these are external benefits or external costs in the case of the pollution or in the case of the all of the debris in the lake. Someone other than the original decision maker, as I said, is going to be victimized as a result of this. And this leads to market failure. Why? Because the market didn't take care of this. And as you can imagine, when you have a capitalist environment in which people can produce items and can buy or not buy those items, you're going to have freedom of choice. And with that is also, well, how do they get rid of it? How do when they're done and they've used up the product, how do they get rid of it? How do they throw it away? How do they recycle it? And maybe those resources weren't readily available. So that leads to market failure. The idea of somebody else is going to have to clean this up, and somebody's going to have to pay to clean that up. That isn't going to clean up itself. That is going to take some work. Either of the examples that I showed you. So if there's no government involvement, that's never going to solve itself. People aren't just going to go over and say, hey, you need to stop polluting. And people aren't just going to say, hey, I'm going to clean that up. So this is where government is going to be involved because others aren't going to be able to have the power to say to a company, hey, you need to clean this up. They're not paying attention. Obviously, they're not paying attention up to this point, and look what's happened up to this point. Likewise with the polluted lake, somebody's going to have to clean that up. It's really nice to think that a benevolent charitable organization would look at this and go, hey, we'll do it. Okay, this time they will, but what happens next time? What happens the time after that? How do we resolve this so it becomes less inefficient in terms of the marketplace? Smoking cigarettes is another example of this in terms of an externality, a market failure. Who buys cigarettes? Well, consumers who smoke, and businesses create those products that sell them to consumers, and those individuals may or may not come down with lung cancer over time and need hospitalization. Maybe they don't have health insurance, or maybe they do, and the health insurance they're relying on is raising the rates of everybody else who's in the plan because they're having to spend more money on hospitalization and care, cancer treatments, and other things to try and stop the cancer and keep them alive. All as a result of smoking cigarettes. So there's an externality here, a market failure that is very negative in that society. Now, obviously, people who didn't smoke are going to have to pay for part of this as part of the insurance plan that this individual is a part of. And that's important to keep in mind because that's the negative externality that we're referring to here. Sometimes government needs to step in. They add a tax on cigarettes. They limit where you can smoke and where you can't smoke. And they really do try and cut back on trying to discourage the level of smoking that is out there. So these are called negative externalities, and we see them time and again. Everything from the barking neighbor's dog to oil spills to smoking to pollution. All of these are negative externalities. And what do we mean by that? Well, it means that somebody else is going to be paying the cost of cleanup, of having to fix the situation. And it's not going to be the person who bought the item. It's not the consumer. And in many cases, it's not the firm or the producer either. It's not the business that made the product for sale. It's someone else, a third party, that is having to take care of it because it's a societal problem at that point. And a chemical company that pollutes the air is another good example of this. If they're polluting the air by producing some type of good that then they're releasing it through their smokestacks into the air, that's a problem that we're all going to have to deal with. It's going to impact third parties as a result of this. They only look at the internal costs in terms of what it costs them to produce the item. But what they're not looking at are the side effects, the spillovers, the social costs or external costs of that pollution. And that is what is leading to a firm's marginal cost curve, essentially its supply curve, and the impact that it has there. So when we're looking at external costs, the concern is Zoram is producing too much of its product. And I mentioned the GE example in class. The idea here of a company that is producing products at low prices, and hey, isn't this great? But the method by which they use it was causing cancer-causing chemicals to seep into the water table. Children and people were taking showers and baths in that water. They were drinking the water. They were washing dishes with the water, and they were all getting sick, coming down with cancer and tumors on their bodies. And this is all a negative externality as a result of an internal cost that the company looks at and says, hey, we're making money. Isn't that great? Well, that's great, but not when it comes to the negative byproducts or the spillovers that we see in these companies and in society. And so government is going to have to step in to do something. And usually this is when we see government step in, is when is it either a safety issue, a health factor, or something that is preventing people from having good health or participating in that. We see this with food all the time. The health department comes in. Why do they shut a business down, or why do they fine a business? Especially a food business in these days, because it could be a spoiled product that is harming an individual if they were to buy it. Could be very poor cleaning practices in the establishment, all kinds of things. But they're doing this from a safety and soundness point of view. They're trying to keep the health of society healthy and trying to help them in that process. So what do we see here? We see an upward sloping marginal private cost, but that's not the social cost. That's just the private cost internally that the company is addressing in terms of what it costs them to make the product. So the marginal social benefit, the downward sloping demand curve that we see here, is the equilibrium where it meets that marginal private cost. And they're going to, in a free market, they're going to create a quantity at which their marginal private cost meets their marginal social benefit, because that's what they look at as the cost of the product. But what we know is that the marginal private cost doesn't include the idea of what society is going to have to bear based on that. And when we look at that, what we call the external costs or the marginal social costs, they're greater. It costs more in terms of what's being produced. So you're actually producing more than you really should in those particular examples. You should be producing less because the marginal social cost is greater there than the marginal private cost. And marginal social benefit meets marginal social cost at a smaller quantity and a higher price. Now, you got a couple of factors here in order to encourage or discourage overproduction and encourage less production. And that's usually a tax. And we talked about this in a previous chapter when we looked at the idea of excise taxes. The tax is added to really bridge the gap between the marginal private cost and the marginal social cost, and that's what we see here. We see the tax essentially is the gap between these two in order to try and address the issues of the social cost and reduce the quantity. And the higher price essentially discourages consumers not all, but some consumers from buying the product, and helps with the smaller quantity at an optimal marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit type of view in terms of what we see there. Now, if we look at this in terms of that difference, why is it a market failure? Well, it's a market failure because you're producing too much. In previous deadweight losses and market failures, we looked at it in terms of the opportunity to produce more, but you weren't because of an excise tax or because of a quantity control. And usually there, it's we're not producing enough. Well, in this example of looking at externalities, we're actually producing too much. We're actually producing in places where we shouldn't be producing. And that is causing what we call an over-allocation, or an additional resources that really shouldn't be produced because of the marginal social costs that are associated with them. That creates the deadweight loss that we see in this space. And in this case, the deadweight loss points to the area of equilibrium in terms of where we should be producing at the optimal quantity that we see here. And that's what we see in that particular model, that particular example. So what do we do to fix it? As I said, we tax it. We use a per unit tax in order to tax that bridges the gap between marginal social cost and marginal private cost. And that does bridge the gap. As a result, there's no deadweight loss when that tax is imposed. So anytime you have a per unit tax imposed in this example, you would not, I repeat, not have a deadweight loss in that particular model that you see there. And that leads to our key graph on negative externalities. Again, a Pigouvian tax, or a tax bridging the gap between these two costs, the marginal private cost, or the supply curve, and the marginal social cost, ultimately the upward sloping supply curve that you'll be producing at E1, at Q1 in terms of quantity, equilibrium at E1, and price level at P1. Now, the consumer is going to pay more for that item, and that is hopefully going to discourage some users from buying that product, which is going to help with the smaller quantity. But there are going to be a significant number of them that would pay the higher price in order to get that product. So that is going to that's going to eliminate the deadweight loss. And ultimately, if we're looking at E1, then our deadweight loss, there isn't any in this model in terms of what we're producing here. If we're producing it where supply meets demand, we would have a deadweight loss, and that deadweight loss would be in this space that we see here, pointing to E1. All right, now let's switch and look at the positive externalities. We can't end on a negative note, of course. We need to look at the positive externalities. And boy, oh boy, are we in the middle of a global pandemic. We think of vaccines as a really positive externality in terms of getting people in to take those shots. That's really important. So let's talk about what positive externalities are. Well, in this case, it's a benefit that someone who is a business or a consumer who is not a part of those initial decisions is actually benefiting from this externality. So that third party in the negative externality that was suffering is now going to benefit from a positive externality. And that is going to spill over to society, to the people in society. They're going to benefit from these types of externalities that we see here. So a flu vaccine is a great example. Coronavirus vaccine is a great example here. That herd immunity can't be developed until enough people have the vaccine and 2 doses, right? So the idea of this vaccine is a positive externality. It's creating benefits for other people in society, not just you. Education is the same way. A positive externality, putting money into education helps to grow society and improve them in a way that really benefits everyone down the road. And that's what we see as positive externalities. So while mom may only look at the internal benefits in terms of getting a flu vaccine for her child, what's the benefit to my child? But it's going to benefit a lot of other people in society as a part of a healthier society that we see there. So the private marginal benefit is essentially going to be her demand curve, the marginal private benefit, but the marginal social benefit is going to be greater as a result of what we see here. And a great example of this is companies who try and offset their negative externalities by doing something positive. And I mentioned the PepsiCo example of corporate citizenship and leadership in that space. They know people need to buy their products and they're in plastic or aluminum cans, and having encouraging recycling programs in urban areas or in low-income areas in order to encourage people to recycle more, and then handling or working with local jurisdictions in order to do that. That's a great example of a positive externality. It offsets the use of plastics and aluminum in terms of the production of those items that could be a negative externality on that lake, but they're trying to offset that, trying to balance that out with positive externalities in terms of recycling programs and other programs to help society as a whole, to help people in the community and that kind of thing. And so government steps in and says, wow, these are great programs, and we can either provide tax incentives to encourage people to do these types of things. We can also provide subsidies. We can cut your taxes or provide tax incentive subsidies in order to encourage businesses to do this sort of thing. This is what leads to the positive externalities we see here. Now, the example that I used in class was the idea of the Uniroyal tire manufacturing plant in Mishawaka, Indiana, a heavy polluter. But what did society do when this company went out of business? They tore it down. They imploded it. And then they worked with business, providing incentives and subsidies to try and turn it into something good, something positive. They redeveloped the entire area. They rezoned it. And they turned it into mixed use. There are businesses here, there are homes, there are apartments, there are other types of employers in these spaces, and it is a very mixed-use type of place that encompasses much larger than the Uniroyal plant did. It also encourages you to get out of your car, so it discourages sprawl and encourages smart growth, a concept we talk about in government class. The idea of smart growth, of having places nearby that you can walk and run and exercise outside, but also you can walk from your home to a place of business where you work, and you can work, live, and play in places like this. These are all positive externalities, turning those negatives into positive externalities. And businesses are provided with tax incentives, different types of programs that will help in aiding in encouraging businesses to do more things like this, to contribute, to help clean up and keep clean these park spaces. And we see the signs all over the highways that say "Adopt a Highway." This stretch of road is sponsored by this business. Those are positive externalities. They're trying to benefit. It doesn't mean that business goes out there and cleans up the trash. It means they're donating to the road crews and construction crews and whatnot to help keep those areas clean. So they're providing positive externalities as a result of this. Now, what we see is the marginal private benefit, the demand curve that's downward sloping, is definitely a benefit to the business, but doesn't always include the benefits to society that we see here. And so we want to make sure we take that into consideration, because there are third parties that benefit from this too. That creates a marginal social benefit, unlike the marginal private benefit. And the benefit is actually greater than the marginal private benefit to society. So you can see that curve is shifting outward or rightward. It's moving up in terms of the benefits that are provided to it. Supply moving along the curve to a greater quantity at a higher price. But again, the reason and the way that we got to that higher price is as a result of positive externalities, different types of programs that government helped with in order to bring us to that optimal level, that quantity that is at a greater or optimal level in terms of what we see here. And so that could be a subsidy that is provided, a tax break, something along those lines, to really help encourage people to partake in this marginal social benefit. So why is it a market failure? Well, because you are in a situation where you could be producing more, but with that marginal private benefit, you're looking at it and maybe you're not, because you're not incentivized to do so. Business is not provided with that benefit. And so you have an underallocation of resources. You're not producing where you could be producing. And this results in deadweight loss. But the idea here is that if you're trying to fix that negative externality by providing a subsidy or a tax incentive to encourage people to participate and businesses to support those types of initiatives, that essentially moves the per unit subsidy essentially moves the quantity outward to that marginal social benefit. It's benefiting society as a result of what we see there. That is leading to our MSB equals MSC at a greater quantity and a higher price. But the price is higher here because the subsidy, the per unit subsidy, is included in that price. So society is not paying any more. Individual consumers aren't paying any more for the products that you're selling. The government is basically stepping in to encourage this type of behavior by providing a subsidy or a tax break or some type of benefit to the business which offsets the cost. And that essentially is what we see in this last and final key graph of AP microeconomics. So we have a marginal social benefit that is greater than the marginal private benefit or the demand curve like we see here. We're moving from E1 to E2 along the supply curve. P3 is at a higher price, but again, it's a subsidized price. This Pigouvian subsidy is essentially what government is pitching in between P1 and P3, and government's paying the difference. That is encouraging businesses to participate, to commit to doing these sorts of things, and it's a quantity that is greater as a result. That's the benefit to society. The government stepping in, providing the subsidy, it's leading to a greater quantity being produced, and as a result, society is benefiting as a result of what we see here. Now, just to review, so what is an externality? What are externalities in terms of market failures? You can pause the video here and look at some of these review questions. Explain why the graph for a negative externality has two cost curves, and then explain why the graph for a positive externality also has two benefit curves. Again, private and social in terms of what you see there. You can pause the video and take a little more time on this one. And the last thing we want to cover in this particular segment is on what we call the tragedy of the commons. We've looked at negative externalities, we've looked at positive externalities, and the tragedy of the commons is essentially this. If we're looking at pollution, and we could spend days here, why is it that public bathrooms are so gross, right? And it's the tragedy of the commons. That is so true. We could look at this as school bathrooms, right? Why are school bathrooms so gross? Well, when you've got 3,000 people in a school and you only have, 10 bathrooms, that's essentially 30 people in a bathroom. And I'm sure there are even more than that that are going through there. But this is the idea of the tragedy of the commons, the common pool problem. Anybody ever been to a pool and there's way too many people and you're like, oh my gosh, why did I come here? There's way too many people in this pool. We see this all the time. And if you've ever ridden on a train, like used to take the Amtrak from DC to New York and back again, by the time you finished your trip, bathrooms on the Amtrak, you do not want to go anywhere near them. Definitely don't sit near them. It's the tragedy of the commons. People are using those resources, and while those goods are available to everybody, there's no incentive to keep them clean. And so people aren't really self-policing. And so unfortunately, people using these products make them worse. And without government or people stepping in to constantly clean them and provide some cleanup methods, you're going to have the tragedy of the commons. They're going to stink. They're going to be gross. And that's the tragedy of the commons, right? So there's no incentive for people to use them more effectively and efficiently. There's no incentive for people to clean up their own mess. So they leave it. And that leads to this grossness that we were talking about. This idea is the tragedy of the commons. We have a lot of spillover costs. Overfishing in the ocean is another great example of this. And again, the common pool problem leads us to this final cartoon. Nobody on the beach this morning. Yeah, that's what it must have looked like when Columbus discovered it. Yeah, and we see all the trash and the pollution and all the things that we see there. So how can markets and self-interest help to limit pollution? Well, we looked at this. The idea of positive externalities include subsidies. In this case, government is selling the right to pollute. So here we have a lake that can absorb 500 gallons of pollutants each year. But we have plants all around the lake that are going to provide more than 500 pollutants. So if you sell the rights to that, and what is each firm going to have the incentive to do? Well, they're going to self-police so that they can get a lower emission standard, and they can sell those rights to a firm that actually emits more, and they're going to make money off of that. This was the model of cap and trade cap and trade model that Congress talked about a few years ago. And the idea there is it discourages old type of energy pollution, and it encourages companies to be more innovative and find new methods for energy that is more clean energy, and to do it at a more effective and efficient cost. Now, we know costs can be expensive when they're first introduced or they're first discovered or invented. But as more technology and innovation takes place, those costs continue to fall. And they would continue to fall at a point that as there's more innovation, more technological advances, that's going to benefit society at a lower cost, and ultimately increase the marginal social benefit to those resources that we see there. We've seen this with acid rain. What are we going to do about acid rain? This is 1994. Look at the entire Mid-Atlantic and East Coast for the most part. Holy cow, what a mess this is. But a lot of government stepping in to try and limit the output of plants that are using coal-fired plants and oil plants and resources along these lines. And they were able to reduce, in only, 16 years, they were able to reduce the amount of acid rain, the amount of hydrogen ion deposition that's in these in these water droplets. And so it really did make a change. I'll go back to that picture just so you can see the difference. Wow, what a difference in terms of the impact that government intervention can have. And that is really the point that we're driving at with these externalities. There is a really great activity called 5-2, which is on externalities. If you need more detail or want to practice with some practice questions here, normally if we were in class 5 days a week, we would have already done this. But this is a really great guide to help you with externalities, and I hope you find it helpful. There's one more activity here, which is on economic efficiency and cleanup, again addressing the models that we talked about here with marginal social benefit and marginal social cost. We will see you in the next segment on public and private goods.